And Ashik, I thought we would address the whole question of military spending for two reasons. One is there's a lot of conversation right now, as you know, out in the country about stimulus in this moment of crisis. And in fact, the Democrats put forth, as you well know, in the House, a $3 trillion stimulus bill, which I have already said in previous programs. I'm going to talk about it again, is too little. It's not enough. And the second thing that happened in the last few days, as you quite well know, is that Bernie Sanders, along with a few co sponsors and Barbara Lee in the House, introduced a bill to cut military spending, the Pentagon spending, by 10%. Um, and it's in the context of the debate over what's called the National Defense Authorization Act. And again, this is for my audience. You're the expert. You know all this. And the design of this was to get $74 billion, and I'm now quoting from Bernie's press release, to create a federal grant program to fund healthcare, housing, childcare, and educational opportunities for cities and towns experiencing a poverty rate of 25% or more. And I just want to quote two or three more things from his prepared text just to give us something to kind of react to. Number one, and now I'm quoting, year after year, Democrats and Republicans who disagree on almost everything come together with minimal debate to support an exploding Pentagon budget, which is now higher than the next 11 nations combined and represents more than half of our discretionary spending. And that's the end of that quote. And then he goes on to talk about the role of the defense contractors in this whole, what I would call, scam. And now I'm quoting again. Since 1995, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and United Technologies have paid over $3 billion in fines or related settlements for fraud or misconduct. Yet those three companies received around $1 trillion in defense contracts over the past 2 decades alone. And then he quoted Martin Luther King in a famous quote that I think many people know about. And I'm quoting again, in 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. warned us that, and he's quoting now Dr. King, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. So, in that context, I wanted to ask you what your reaction is to this attempt to cut the budget, both in terms of the 10%, is it enough, and what your other thoughts are.
Yeah, thanks so much for that introduction. I mean, that MLK quote is a really perfect way to frame it because it shows that, he said that in, I think, 1967. That's over 40 years ago at this point. So this is not a new priority, cutting the military budget and shifting priorities, like reinvesting in other social forms of spending. That's not new. People have been saying that for many, many decades, that the US is spending too much on its military compared to housing and healthcare and all sorts of other things that are going unmet in times of need. Which has really always been the case, and it's more stark than ever in the time of coronavirus. And I think the number of unemployed people right now is approaching half. I haven't seen the most recent count, but it's really alarming. Over 40 million people lost jobs in the first 2 months after the crisis began. So there are just so many other things right now that the government could be spending on, but this military budget just keeps growing and growing. So this 10% cut is really something that is extremely reasonable. This is a reasonable, modest cut, as Bernie Sanders said, that no one should say no, no matter who you are, if you're conservative or liberal or on the left or right. There's so much waste and problematic spending in the Pentagon budget that everybody should be able to say yes to a 10% cut. Just to put it in context, that would only take us back to the Obama years. Like in the past 3 years alone, under the Trump administration, I think the Pentagon budget has grown by over $100 billion to the point where now they're talking about increasing it to 740 billion in the next, which is the number that they're proposing a 10% cut from. So uh, there's really no justification for this continued increase. There's so many places in the budget that Senator Sanders and Markey and others who have signed on to this bill have pointed to as places that could be cut. They don't specify. I don't think they exactly specify where that 10% would come from, but there are lots and lots of places that you could point to. At just starting with bloat and overhead.
Mm. And so let's dwell on a couple of points that you just raised here. The first thing is, and it's reflecting what Bernie Sanders said, this is the fault of Republicans and Democrats over many years. Your point that this cut would only bring us back to what Obama had basically proposed and gotten passed during his presidency, it shows the level at which there has been basically unanimity and pretty much a bipartisan consensus to keep shoving tons of money at the Pentagon. This goes back decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been on and off for many decades, like since World War II, which I think was, if you adjust for inflation, was sort of an all-time high in terms of military spending as a proportion of national spending. But the amount of spending that we have now, I think you may have quoted it, but it's already higher than the military spent at the height of the Cold War or during the wars in Vietnam and Korea. I think the only years when it was higher were at the peak of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars during, I believe, the Bush years. So this is the highest amount of military spending we've had at almost any point since World War II. And if we think about, the narratives that are told about how military spending is justified, World War II is always the example in terms of, the national story that politicians tell about America. That was the good war. We were fighting, fascism itself. But since then, the narrative just becomes more and more vague and diffuse. During the Cold War, there was this great other geopolitical power, the Soviet Union, that we were supposedly competing against, that justified all the spending. But we don't even really have that anymore. There's been a real attempt, an ongoing attempt that's actually escalating now to present China and Russia as great powers that we're competing with. But even then, the US spends more than the next 10 countries combined. And if we cut the entire military budget in half, it would still be bigger than China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea combined. So, yeah, and most of the other major military spenders are US allies in Europe or Japan or other countries where there's no conceivable threat from them.
And
So,
clearly, what's driving this and has been driving this for a long time, as I quoted from Bernie's prepared text, is the defense contractors. I mean, they are making money hand over fist, and it's the real profit motivation that's driving it. I don't care about all the great flag waving and all the great calls to national defense and national security. What's driving it at the corporate level, as is the case at so many in so many cases and so many instances, is the drive for profits, right?
exactly. Of that $740 billion budget, about half of it goes to military contractors. So companies like Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, they're just raking in profits, and there's really very little accountability on how that money is spent. There are all sorts of cost overruns that constantly happen. There are all sorts of settlements and fines that have been levied over the past few years for fraud and misconduct. And usually the settlements are much stronger than any actual transgression that they're found to have committed. Uh, and the very same defense contractors that have been found guilty or reached settlements for fraud are also paying their CEOs really excessive compensation packages. Like if you look at any measure, like comparing the CEO pay to their average worker pay, it's just a huge disparity. So a lot of these federal funds for defense contractors, which make up half of the military budget, they're going straight to the top.
And I'm now digging into my gray cells. I used to read about this more carefully some years ago, all this defense budget stuff. So you'll correct me if I'm totally off about this. But as I remember it, these defense contractors, it's almost a no lose business, meaning they basically jerk up the prices, they over charge. And so when you get a contract for a big weapon system, say a fighter or an aircraft carrier or a nuclear submarine, you can't lose. You're going to make money.
Exactly. There are just not very many examples of Congress or the president ever using their powers of oversight to hold contractors accountable for when they do things wrong. Like one of the most famous examples is the F-35, this fighter jet that's cost many tens of billions already by some measures. Yeah, just approaching really astronomical costs over decades, and all sorts of issues where they just don't work properly at all. Like there are all sorts of crazy accidents. And like launching seats catching on fire just doesn't make any sense. Like even the stated rationale for why these jets are necessary are in the context of some kind of hot war with another nation, which we shouldn't ever get to if we're actually promoting peace and trying to do diplomacy. Like the big military budget is, and the more it's driven up by uh, the profit motives of these companies, the more likely it is that we're going to use these weapons rather than investing more in diplomacy and actual attempts at peace and cooperation. So the more we spend on these weapon systems for the profits of companies, the more likely we are to get into some escalation that is going to just cost lives for no reason.
And it's quite interesting, I'm sure, for you when you watch the debates on these budgets to hear that these things pass almost without objection. As I pointed out from Bernie's statement, it's something that Democrats and Republicans totally unite about just throwing money at the Pentagon. Whereas, by contrast, when we're talking about building schools or giving workers $600 a month or $1,200 a month in the worst economic crisis in our memory, in our lifetimes, all of a sudden there's all those deficit hawks and those people wringing their hands about spending too much money. This must strike you as quite hypocritical.
Yeah, absolutely. It's only ever when we're talking about spending on things that would actually benefit people and meet real human needs that we start getting asked questions about how we pay for it. But that's never asked about tax cuts for the wealthy, and it's never asked about raising the military budget. We're what I think just barely 2 months past this enormous uh, uh, economic package that was passed supposedly as a means to boost the economy after the coronavirus crisis, but most of that was handouts to corporations. Most people just got one check for $1,200 when they're losing their jobs and struggling to pay rent and meet basic needs. So there's $2 trillion that can just be created out of thin air to basically bail out corporations that are suffering, but not for the people. And meanwhile, we're talking about raising the military budget during the greatest economic crisis since the Depression. So it really just makes no sense, and it just exposes what's really behind all this.
And it highlights the difference between two views and two versions of what national defense means for you and I, and for I think many people, many progressives. We think of national defense as making sure that everybody has a job, that everybody can have health care that doesn't send them into bankruptcy, that schools aren't crumbling, that people can get actual real unemployment insurance when, God forbid, they lose their job, mostly because of corporate decisions, versus a view of national defense that's about giving the Pentagon a ton of money to conduct all these wars that essentially kill people and do nothing to strengthen the nation.
That's absolutely right. And also, we often hear about the need to support the troops, right? Like we're funding the military so much because we're supporting the troops who are bravely putting themselves in harm's way to keep us all safe. But if you look at where the money is going in the Pentagon budget, half of it is going to these defense contractor companies. Only a fifth goes to the troops themselves in terms of their salaries and benefits. So this 10% cut being presented now in an amendment is careful to emphasize that uh, support for the troops, their benefits and salaries are not going to be part of that, but they're going to focus on all these forms of waste and fraud and corruption, which is where there is a lot of potential to get conservative support as well. I think plenty of people who tend to vote Republican aren't aware that these are the actual dynamics behind the Pentagon budget, and when they find out, they tend to be upset. There are plenty of conservatives and more libertarian leaning Republicans who have co-signed a lot of these types of amendments and resolutions that Sanders and other progressives have presented.
My
Um,
favorite slogan from back during the Iraq War is support the troops, bring them home alive. That was the thing that we used to respond to. And to your point, I remember that a few years ago, Rand Paul and Barney Frank united together on an attempt to cut the Pentagon budget quite significantly for the reasons that you just said. So if I gave you the magic wand, then I gave you all the power to say this is what we should do, because frankly 10% is just really a very modest cut. What would you do? How deeply could we cut the Pentagon budget and do it in a progressive way, as you point out, not to hurt people's salaries and the benefits that people who are serving now, and certainly when you think about veterans, for example, people who have served already, and there's some obligation to keep either their pensions or certainly their health care intact. What would you do?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question because I mean, again, as even the proponents of this amendment are saying, 10% is a modest beginning to start reinvesting in real priorities. So there's actually another resolution that was introduced in the past week or two by Representative Barbara Lee, who's also co-signing this 10% cut for a cut of almost half, of $350 billion 10% is something like $74 billion. So she's proposing 350 billion, and that's been co-signed by a bunch of other progressives, including some of the newer, more recent ones like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and that doesn't have as much support because it's seen as much more of a flex goal. Right now, 10% is, I think, the benchmark they're really trying to consolidate in the next year. But the $350 billion number comes from a bunch of sources, but the National Priorities Project, where I work, published a report last year with the Poor People's Campaign called the Moral Budget that introduced an itemization of how we could cut $350 billion safely by targeting a lot of the things that this amendment is targeting, but also expanding that to include actually ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, bringing the troops home, really going after military contractors in a much bigger way, closing overseas military bases. Right now, the US has over 800 foreign military bases all over the world. To put that in context, the next largest country has about 20. That's 780 more foreign bases than any other country has. And that's very expensive. And there's just extremely little accountability about what those bases are even doing, how they're spending that money. And in a lot of places, they're very unpopular. So cutting those bases by 60%, which would still leave us with 300 overseas military bases, which is way more than any other country has. That's a pretty reasonable place to start. That could get us, I think, about $100 billion in cuts. So I think this 10% cut is a really modest place to start. It makes a lot of sense just because there are very easy ways you could do that, just probably by tackling bloat, like literally like accounting better than they have been, because it's really worth emphasizing that the Pentagon is the only agency in the federal government that has failed an audit. It hadn't been audited at all in decades, and it actually just finally was in the past 2 years, and it failed. Like they could not make the numbers add up. So holding it accountable to some kind of accounting process would probably cut a lot of money right off the bat. So those are a bunch of things, and then there are other things like cutting unnecessary weapon systems, many of which can run up to 10 or $15 billion or more. There are submarines, attack submarines that cost $12 billion or more, aircraft carriers that add up to about $10 billion, Navy destroyers that are $8 billion. So there are all these things. And then there are more recent projects that have passed under the Trump administration, like Space Force, which can give a clear explanation of what that even is going to be, why it's necessary.
Right. That's a pretty wacky idea. But anyway, thank you very much for being on the program, and keep up your great advocacy for returning us to a sane policy around defense, and keep on pushing for those much deeper cuts. And thanks for being on the show.
All right. Thank you so much.